y sesiones las guías que están en PDF, los recuerdo que las bajen. Nomás me presentó, venía a compartir lo que ella sabe, entonces vamos a hacer su práctica y con todo gusto, si hay preguntas, pues procedemos a traducir.
Buenos días a todos y primero quiero decir gracias a Dr. Levanto para la oportunidad de asistir. Creo que eso es una oportunidad muy importante para todos aquí en salud pública, aumentar nuestra red para más información sobre el chikungunya. Ahora, porque solamente conozco un poco de español, creo que es mejor para ustedes si yo hablo en inglés. Lo siento. Y gracias por su paciencia. So first of all, to understand what chikungunya will do as it spreads through the Americas, I think it's important to have an understanding of what the virus has done in the past 10 years and how very quickly it has moved throughout the region. So first of all, here in the Americas, you obviously are familiar with several other alpha viruses. There's Venezuelan equine encephalitis viruses, there's Eastern equine encephalitis virus, and Western, all of which you have seen here in the Americas. And chikungunya here is quite distinct from all of these other viruses that you're familiar with. Chikungunya is most similar to a virus in the Americas called Mayaro, which many of you may have heard of as well. But this will be important when we talk about diagnostics and how distinct it is and how we'll be able to distinguish chikungunya from these other viruses in the laboratory. And it's also important to talk about the varieties of chikungunya. There are 3 distinct lineages. There's the Central East African, as we heard earlier. The virus originated in East Africa and Tanzania, and this is that original lineage from the Central East African region. There's an Asian genotype, which is what is shown up here in the Americas, and there's a very distinct West African genotype that has so far not been involved in any of these major outbreaks. So how is chikungunya transmitted? Well, it's a zoonotic disease, so it's maintained in nature in Africa in a cycle between non-human primates and a variety of forest-dwelling mosquitoes, mostly of the Aedes stegomyia subgenus. When a person moves into this ecology, or they work right on the border between the forest and the rural areas, the human can become infected by one of these mosquitoes, and then they bring that back to an urban cycle, which is what we're familiar with, where the mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, transmit the virus to men. And this cycle is just man to mosquito to man, similar to dengue. So I put this up to show the distribution of chikungunya outbreaks ever since the introduction of the virus, or the detection of the virus. And you can see it's mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And each of these circles represents an individual outbreak. And this is the historical pattern of chikungunya. There would be an outbreak, they would go through a community, and then the virus would basically disappear from that region, and we might not have an outbreak for several years again. This is really different from what has happened over the past decade. So really, in 2004 was when the ongoing epidemic of chikungunya occurred. And that actually began here on the coast of Africa, in particular right on the coast of Kenya. And this is very important. This is where I say the clinicians are some of the most important people in identifying chikungunya outbreaks and recognizing that it's something different. Because originally this outbreak was thought to be a malaria outbreak, that they normally had malaria, and suddenly they had a huge number of increase of this malaria-like disease. But the clinicians recognized it looked different because the joint pain was atypically severe. So there was much more intense pain, and this wasn't common with a malaria case. When they looked at blood smears, 91% of the blood smears were malaria negative. So this was a good indication that there was something other than malaria. And after this, they went through and tested for a variety of other agents, West Nile, dengue, and they tested for chikungunya and found both virus and antibody against chikungunya. So they knew this outbreak was caused by chikungunya. And this outbreak lasted for about 6 months in 2004. Well, normally we would have expected it to disappear, but what happened was, if we look here where the outbreak originated, in Kenya, a few months later, in the islands of Comoros, just off the coast of Africa, they had what they thought was a dengue outbreak. But again, the clinicians recognized it didn't look quite right, so they tested for dengue, and because they knew of this outbreak, they tested for chikungunya as well. And they found, again, virus and antibody, and very importantly, they had almost 90% of the cases were presenting. So most of the people who become infected with chikungunya are going to show up with symptoms. And we'll talk more about the symptoms in a few minutes. The other important thing about this outbreak was that over 65% of the population was affected in about 5 months. So it was very fast, there are very high attack rates, and a very large percentage of the population can become affected. So this will be something else that will help identify chikungunya as it moves through the Americas. Even at this point, though, in Comoros, there had already been about 250,000 cases, and there had been really no word about it. The outbreaks had been ongoing for almost 2 years, and there was no global awareness. Well, suddenly, the virus moved to La Reunion, which is a collection of islands just over here from Comoros. Now, they actually had cases occurring at the same time as the epidemic in Comoros, but just a handful of cases, not that many. And suddenly, when they saw the increase in rainy season, the mosquito populations blossomed, and suddenly they had a tremendous increase in the number of cases. So as we're moving into the rainy season here in the Americas, this is a time to be more vigilant for what might be occurring. In La Reunion, again, they had almost 250,000 cases, and there was a switch of vectors here, which was very important for the virus continuing to move. Because in La Reunion, there are very few Aedes aegypti, but they do have a lot of Aedes albopictus. So suddenly, this epidemic here was able to progress because now there was a second vector that was just as important as the original Aedes aegypti vector. The virus is moving. Okay, so the virus didn't stay still. It wasn't an isolated outbreak, as we've seen historically. The virus continued to move, so it started in Africa, moved to the islands of just off the coast, and from here, it continued to move, and it moved on to India. Well, India is worth mentioning because India had chikungunya in the past. In fact, one of the largest outbreaks of chikungunya ever had occurred in India in the 1970s. So they were very familiar with it, but they hadn't had an epidemic for over 30 years. So this was almost like a new virus to them. And in the first year alone in India, in 2006, they had an estimated 1.3 million cases. So those of you working in public health can imagine how intense that is, how many people are coming to the clinics and the hospitals, how many requests there are for diagnosis. And keep in mind, because all these people are symptomatic, half of your public health officials are sick as well, your doctors are sick, your laboratorians are sick, so they're all staying home. So this is an incredible drain on your public health resources. This was also the first time that the Central East African genotype had moved outside of Africa, and that's something that we'll talk a bit more about later in terms of surveillance. Well, as you can imagine, with 1.3 million cases, there were a lot of visitors coming to India who were becoming infected and then taking the virus back to their own countries. So the virus spread from India to multiple parts of Southeast Asia, to Indonesia, to Sri Lanka, to Thailand, and of course, very famously, the virus moved to Italy. And this was important because this was the first time the virus had moved to a subtropical region and was now able to be transmitted locally. So this brought the attention of many public health officials in the Americas because now there was concern that areas that had never before seen chikungunya were suddenly going to be able to be infected. So the activity continued, and I just want to point out that it's still ongoing. This epidemic hasn't ended now for several years. But there were some incidents in 2011 that were important to note. New Caledonia, which is a small island just off the coast of Australia, had an outbreak in 2011. Well, you think that's not that exciting. We know it's in Southeast Asia. We know there's lots of chikungunya. Well, the interesting thing is this was due to Asian genotype, so a completely different lineage of chikungunya. This means that there was multiple emergence events. The virus was circulating in a lot of these areas zoonotically and was reemerging because of the increased surveillance and effort to monitor for the virus. At the same time, in the Republic of Congo, there was another emergence event. It was a Central East African genotype, but it was a different lineage, so it wasn't the same outbreak. So we're continuing to see multiple outbreaks of chikungunya in multiple places because of the increased surveillance and awareness. And this is very important and what will help us here in the Americas. A number of other countries continued to have activity in 2011. The same thing in 2012. And there's a couple to point out here. In Cambodia, for example, there was one village within just a matter of weeks. Half of the villagers were infected. And this was interesting because the vector was Aedes aegypti. So even though everybody is now focusing on Aedes albopictus as the primary vector, we have to remember that Aedes aegypti, which is of course prevalent throughout the Americas, is still an incredibly efficient vector of chikungunya. Yemen is also worth noticing simply because there was another new place. The chikungunya had never been in the Middle East before, and it was continuing to spread to novel areas. 2013, I list a lot of different cases here. This was a very, very active year, as everybody's aware. But again, there's a couple I want to point out because these are directly involved in what's happening here in the Americas now. So the Philippines had some activity, and there were several hundred cases, several different islands, and there's a lot of movement from people in the Philippines to the Americas. So an increased amount of transmission and movement of virus was possible. And the Philippine strains that we've identified are very similar to those from Indonesia. And these are all Asian genotype. And so it's very likely the virus moved from Indonesia up to the Philippines and then to the Americas. So of course at this point we're very concerned. We know the virus is moving. We know we're worried. So I call it the coming storm, la tormenta, no? If we look at this map, all of the countries in green are areas where chikungunya was being transmitted locally. And everything between these two green lines is the region where Aedes aegypti is very prominent. So what's very obvious is this entire gap with no green. So no transmission in an area where there's a tremendous risk of chikungunya activity. In fact, there's so many factors, I want to list a few of them that are very important. First of all, we have a completely naive population. Nobody has pre-existing antibodies to chikungunya in the Americas, so everybody is at risk. Next, we have a lot of social factors. People spend a lot of time outdoors. They're exposed to mosquitoes repeatedly. Similarly, some of the ecological conditions favor the mosquitoes. And in fact, both of the mosquitoes, as we've already mentioned, exist in this region. So we have both of the vectors, all the right conditions. A lack of public health response, simply because people weren't aware of chikungunya. Information isn't available to clinicians or to the public. There are no diagnostic tests already in place at this point. So these are all very concerning and why there's increased risk here. Plus, this is a very important point, again, we'll talk about in diagnostics. But chikungunya, when it infects a person, they develop a very high level of viremia. In fact, as high as 10 to the 8 particles per milliliter of blood. And the duration of the viremia can be up to 1 week. So very high viremia for a very long time. So if you're in Indonesia or the Philippines, you can easily become infected and be viremic when you return to the Americas. So the risk of chikungunya moving to the Americas was tremendous. In fact, we were surprised it hadn't happened before now. We know that there were many imported cases to the Americas. As early as 2006, in French Guiana, there were cases introduced. In the French West Indies, there were imported cases. The U.S. had a number of cases imported between 2005 and 2012. Canada had cases important, and of tremendous concern was the fact that Brazil, in two of the most populated areas of Rio and Sao Paulo, had a tremendous number of imported cases as well. But none of these actually translated into localized transmission. And if we look just at what happened in the U.S. in terms of number of imported cases, we see for years there were a few cases here and there, but suddenly starting in 2005, a tremendous increase in the number of travelers bringing the virus into the U.S. So clearly the risk was going up all the time. And it finally did happen. In December of 2013, again as we heard, the virus was introduced or first detected, first reported in the Caribbean. And the reporting event actually occurred right here on December 6th from the island of St. Martin. But when they looked at samples retrospectively, they actually identified that the first case was probably here in mid-October. So the virus had been circulating on this island for about 3 months before there was any report of chikungunya in an infected person. Well, we think, okay, this is a small number of cases. This is during the dry season, so maybe not that much transmission. And if we look at what happened just in about 1 month, there was about 300 cases limited to 4 islands of the Caribbean. And these are all French West Indies areas. So we think, well, maybe that's not going to be quite so bad. Well, unfortunately, this is a current map, 1 week old, so it's already a little out of date. And you can see virtually all of the islands of the Caribbean are now affected. Parts of South America, French Guiana and Guyana, as you've all heard now, El Salvador probably is positive as well. So, and if you look at all the little stars, you can see areas where the virus has been exported from these affected regions in the Caribbean. So if we look at the actual number of cases, here's a list of the 19 countries now that in 6 months have been affected with chikungunya, and these are all locally transmitted. And in these 19 countries, we have over 170,000 cases already in 6 months. So you can see how quickly it's moving. And additionally, there's another 9 countries listed, and I don't have El Salvador on here, but 9 additional countries where imported cases have been detected. So clearly the virus is moving very fast. So what do we need to know that's practical? And really what we want to know is, what does chikungunya look like? How do we detect it? So the primary symptoms, there's a list of symptoms that show up with chikungunya patients, but the vast bulk of patients present with fever and polyarthralgia. And the fever is very interesting. First of all, it's a high fever, greater than 38 degrees Celsius. And it's a very rapid onset. When I've met patients with chikungunya, they can almost tell you the exact hour that their fever spiked. So they're very aware of the symptom onset. And the arthralgia, as we've talked about, is extremely severe, very debilitating. Patients you need won't want to shake your hand because that hurts their joints too much. Or if they're laying on their bed or their couch, they won't stand up because their ankles hurt too bad to stand. So it's a very, very significant, very severe joint pain, and usually in the small joints, the peripheral small joints, so the wrists, fingers, the ankles. And again, as I mentioned, the vast majority of patients who are infected will present with symptoms. So really what we're going to see is fever and this arthralgia. Sometimes there's other things, myalgias, headaches, a rash is noted depending on the population. So a variety of symptoms, but this is mostly what we're going to see. Clinically, this is what it looks like. It's not particularly remarkable to look at it. This person has some swelling of the joints in their fingers. Similarly, a person has swelling in the ankle, tenosynovitis results. These are a couple of examples of the rash. It's maculopapular rash. Looks very similar to many, many other agents. So this is about all you're going to see as a clinician. It's not particularly striking in terms of presentation. And even more challenging here in the Americas is chikungunya will look like many, many other illnesses. Malaria, it will look very similar to malaria upon first presentation. Dengue, of course, is going to look very similar. Now, there are a few distinctions. Chikungunya, for example, is more likely to have lymphopenia, but these are not characteristic of one virus or the other. So those standard laboratory findings won't be diagnostic, because it will look a lot like dengue fever. It'll look like leptospirosis. And other viruses, such as Arbovirus, will look very similar as well. So clinically, the differential diagnosis will be challenging. So we do have a lot of information now from travelers to give you a good idea of the timing of the viremia, as well as the antibodies, and hopefully this will aid in the diagnostic algorithm. So right here we see the day of onset and of symptoms. And when they actually present with symptoms, the red line here shows the viremia. So they already have a high viremia by the time they show up with symptoms. In fact, here this particular case was 10 to the 6th. But as I mentioned, the amount of virus can be 10 to the 8 ppm per mil. So very high levels of virus in the blood. Once they present with symptoms, the viremia can last for about a week, up to a week. So during that first week, molecular assays are going to be a good detection method. And we'll talk more about detection in a few minutes. IgM antibody actually comes up very early. It can be as early as 3 days to 4 days. Certainly by 1 week, IgM antibodies are prevalent. And IgG antibodies also come up early. They start coming up as early as 1 week. So this is a good indication of what tests we might want to use. So serological tests, which of course is what most folks are probably familiar with. IgM is a good way to go if you have an early sample because, again, the antibody does come up quite quickly. And of course, what we want to know, since most of you are familiar, for example, with flavivirus antibodies and how cross-reactive they are, is much less of a problem with alphaviruses. There's not as much cross-reactivity. So if you get a positive for chikungunya, it is probably chikungunya. In fact, we did some comparisons where these are all chikungunya positives. Anything above a 3 is positive. And the other viruses here in the Americas, Venezuelan, Mayaro, and Eastern, you can see that they're mostly negative. Now there's a couple of Mayaro cases that come up positive, and one Eastern that come up positive. But for the most part, it's a very, very specific test, so that will be very helpful. If you are lucky enough to get a convalescent sample as well, acute and convalescent, you can use IgG ELISA to look for seroconversion, and that would be very helpful. And of course, there's neutralization for confirmation. But chikungunya virus is listed as a biosafety level 3 virus, so it requires increased levels of containment to perform diagnostics with live virus. Of course, what we want to know is, will these assays pick up any of the different lineages? As I mentioned, there are several distinct varieties of chikungunya. So what was originally looked at in this massive outbreak was the Central East African genotype. But what's here in the Americas is this Asian genotype. So as one assay, when we pick up any strain of chikungunya, and what we did was we looked at some cross-neutralization, and these are samples collected from the coast of Africa. We worked on IgM assays, IgG assays, and the antibody titers against the homologous virus were very high. They were even higher for the heterologous, the Asian genotype. So this is very good indication that no matter what strain of chikungunya you have, the diagnostic assay will pick it up. So that's good news. We don't have to have multiple tests. But of course, because chikungunya has such a high viremia and so many of the patients present with symptoms, a molecular assay, if you have an acute sample, is an excellent diagnostic tool. And there are a variety of options. There's the traditional RT-PCR with agarose gels. Detects about 100 copies, so it's fairly sensitive, about $5 per reaction. And there's a couple of other alternatives that have been published on. These are a little bit more expensive. But the most sensitive assay is a real-time PCR assay. It detects as little as 5 copies of virus, and it's only about $3 per reaction. So Dr. Rob Lanciati in our laboratory developed molecular detection of real-time PCR. He has 2 sets of primers and probes, so you can test in one area, reconfirm in a different area of the genome. And it does detect all of the distinct genotypes. And we're more than happy to share this protocol with anybody who would be interested. It's very sensitive. It can detect as few as 25 copies of virus. So because there's so much virus in a patient sample or a mosquito sample, this works as well on mosquitoes, you need very, very little sample, and the values for positive, CT values, are somewhere in the 15 to 20 range. So it's a very sensitive, very specific assay. So I want to walk you through some diagnostic information so you can kind of see how it works. So what we have in the red box are samples from patients collected between 1 and 7 days after illness onset. So these are the acute samples. Below the red box are the convalescent samples, or the later samples. And what we see first, if we look at the molecular assays, 80% of these samples that are collected within the first week after illness onset are positive when we look for the virus nucleic acid. So again, very sensitive and very easy to detect. If we look at the serology of these same samples, you can see virtually all of these are negative. And again, anything above a level 3 is positive. So in the early acute samples, a molecular test is the best. Now, if we look at these convalescent samples, if it's more than 1 week since illness onset, virtually all of these now have antibody, and none of them have nucleic acid. So in terms of what we want to look at, this is a nice summary. If you have a sample collected between days 1 and 3 post-illness onset, a nucleic acid, RT-PCR, is probably going to be positive. Your serology test will be negative. If it's between days 4 and 8, that's kind of that transition when people might have antibody, might not. So an RT-PCR might be positive or negative, and the same with serology. This is kind of that intermediate time. If it's after 1 week old, you'll want to do a serology test because all of your RT-PCRs will be negative at that point. So some other important lab findings, as I said, 80% of all the specimens collected in that first week will be positive for virus, actual nucleic acid. And again, it's a very high level of viremia, so it should be very easy to detect using a molecular approach. People always want to know about commercial options because obviously these assays are sometimes challenging to set up in labs. There are a number of companies here that have various assays. There's some rapid RBT tests. There's on-site testing performed. There's some companies that have dual Chikungunya dengue kits, so that might be an option. There's some IFA kits, and this list is already out of date. There's a company that has a product available in the Americas, an IgG analyzer from the company Abcam, and this is one we've tested in our lab, so we know we've been able to validate it versus our assays. We know that was a very good product, a very good IgM assay. Some of these have had outside evaluations performed. There's some publications on them. What I would recommend is that there are some limitations with some of them, and this depends on the timing of your sample that was collected, and so on. So we would love to be able to test more of these assays and provide you with the information. As we do that, it will be provided, but for now, there are a variety of options available and more all the time. So what have we been doing to respond? There's been a lot of activity from the public health officials, by PAHO, by CDC, by CARPA. There's a lot of regional testing being provided. We provide this in CDC in Fort Collins. CARPA provides this. There's been a lot of training for clinicians and for laboratorians. We can do these trainings on site. We can do them by sharing protocols, by sharing reagents. There's been a lot of reagent production and sharing. There's now a variety of public health materials that are available online. This is the CDC website where you can find this. You can also find these on the PAHO website. And they are information for public health officials, for clinicians, for laboratorians, for vector control people. And most of them are in both English and Spanish. So hopefully those will be useful to you as well. So in closing, I want to revisit this map. We can see that there's now a little bit of activity here in the Western Hemisphere, but what we want to look at is the fact that most of it is still susceptible. So we want to continue our surveillance and awareness and interactions, and the more quickly this information can be shared, the more quickly we're able to work together towards trying to contain it a little bit. So with that, I want to thank the folks who were responsible for all the work. I'm just lucky enough to come. My lab folks, the diagnostic lab folks, the epidemiologists, and gracias por su atención. Y si tienen preguntas, bueno,
Evidence that having a pre-existing infection with another virus